Here we go. This is Civil Rights Video 5, focusing on the period between 1955 to 1961 as the movement really ramps up. Starting with the sit-in memo. So what was the sit-in movement? In 1964, black college students sat down at a whites-only lunch counter in Greensboro, North Carolina. Within weeks, this sit-in tactic had spread to over 200 cities. It was quite inspirational and really got attention. Example, in Nashville, black and white students sat down at lunch counters throughout the city for several months. And so this was not just black students, but is focused on them. The Nashville campaign resulted in more than 150 arrests and national media attention. In some cities, students were attacked by white mobs. The sit-ins often forced stores to desegregate or shut down completely because of the chaos, because they weren't really serving, and bad publicity. And the city of Nashville began to desegregate all public facilities. And so really this is forcing the South to recognize the laws. They're going to go from de jure, the law, segregation, to de facto, as far as getting rid of de facto and actually following the laws. And this really helped to establish nonviolent direct action as a useful tactic for challenging white supremacy. Nonviolent, and that they are not bringing violence, although they may face it, and certainly direct action, really challenging the system. So, Ella Baker, let's talk about her as we focus more into Mississippi. In 1960, Ella Baker organized a conference for these sit-in activists, and for these really college students. 200 students arrived and heard speeches from Martin Luther King and other major black civil rights leaders. And Ella Baker urged the students to channel the energy from the sit-ins, because it was working, into the fight against racism and segregation in all aspects of society. It's an important first step. So from 1940, so kind of a little intro to her, from 1940 to 1953, Ella Baker was working for the national NAACP, and during that time she was getting a little frustrated with the organization, and she felt that the NAACP's focus on national legal reform, just the courts, left a majority of the members, which were poor blacks, with little role to play in its work, and that they were part of the club, but they weren't doing much. They didn't have an active role, and they weren't lawyers. And so in 1957, she joins the Southern Christian Leadership Council as its executive director. And Baker tried to get the SCLC to devote more of its attention to women and students, but no. Most of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference leaders, they were ministers, they were men, and they resisted her ideas. And so she's trying to get out women's voices and young people's voices, poor people's voices, and she feels that they're not part of the movement when the movement is for them. And the SCLC in particular was really limited by its dependence on the central leadership of MLK. She wanted more than just one figurehead. The NAACP and other black organizations had long depended on these kind of key leaders, usually educated middle-class men like King, for political leadership. And she believed that, no, the movement needs to organize poor black communities to fight for change. We want to have them fight for themselves. And so at her urging, the students make their own organization, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC. And SNCC set out to attack white supremacy through nonviolent direct action in the model of the sit-in movement. And SNCC also wanted to develop political leaders among the poor black Southerners, not the same old, same old. They wanted to focus on the bottom, where they really were trying to create change. Unlike the NAACP, the organization was mostly young people, many of them women, so we're changing the movement a bit. The Freedom Riders is a key example. And so we said the sit-ins and then the Freedom Riders. And so in 1961, 13 activists brought together by CORE, the Congress of Racial Equality, boarded 2 buses in Washington, D.C., headed on a trip throughout the South. The Supreme Court had already outlawed segregation in interstate bus terminals. This is de facto, de jure, illegal, but not de facto, in that they were still segregated. And so they wanted to really challenge these bus stations to get with the times. And so these Freedom Riders, black and white students, wanted to challenge the federal government to enforce its own laws. So in Alabama, they arrive at one of these segregated bus stations, and white mobs attacked the activists, setting one of the buses on fire, savagely beating several of the students. Coverage of the event sparked international outrage at local police who allowed the violence to occur. Energized by the events and ready to take action, black and white students from a variety of cities began riding buses into Mississippi to challenge segregation. And this is very much direct action, and they are faced with extreme violence. President Kennedy, JFK, tries to convince the Freedom Riders to abandon their efforts. He says, hey, you guys are getting beaten severely, and he's worried that this is just going to lead to more violence and not create change. And it made us look really bad. The Soviet Union were in the middle of the Cold War, and our rival, the Soviet Union, used the poor treatment of African Americans to really criticize the USA, showing that, hey, we have our own problems. Kennedy agreed to allow local police to arrest the riders if the state promised to protect them from violence. So Kennedy kind of gave in and really isn't pushing the change that the protesters are hoping for. The freedom rides into Mississippi continued, and by the end of the summer, 328 activists had been arrested. In prison, the activists developed important relationships. They start to work together and have the time to plan. And this is really going to help the movement in the future. September of '61, under pressure from civil rights activists and U.S. Attorney General Robert Kennedy, JFK's brother, the Interstate Commerce Commission issued orders to desegregate all interstate bus facilities. So hey, it's the law, and now the president's actually doing something about it, but a few skulls had to be cracked in the process. So how are the SNCC activists divided about voter registration in Mississippi? What's the next step? Summer of '60, SNCC Field Secretary Bob Moses, here he is with the glasses, made a trip into Mississippi to kind of see how bad is it down there and what should our next steps be. And a lot of the locals and NAACP activists, they tell Moses that because blacks were the majority in many counties, they could really win political power if they just had the right and ability. They had the right, but they didn't have the ability to vote. In 1961, as SNCC began operation in Mississippi, the young activists kind of debated on what they should do. Should it be direct action, like the freedom rides, like the sit-ins, or should it just be something as simple as voter registration? What should they do as their primary tactic? And JFK felt that voter registration would be less confrontational, it'd lead to less violence than direct action protests like the sit-ins or freedom rides. And so JFK is more for less violence and slow change. Reflecting on the success of the sit-ins and the freedom rides, they argued that direct action would have been more effective and empowering than voter registration. Ella Baker comes in and helps the students to kind of reach a compromise. And so they kind of developed two wings, one on voter registration, one on direct action. And after a little while of just registering people to vote, it becomes really clear that registering voters could be just as confrontational and dangerous as direct action, that people will die for trying to register to vote. Examples. In Macomb, one of the major cities in Mississippi, Herbert Lee, who was involved in the voter registration drive, was shot and killed by a Mississippi state legislature in broad daylight for just going around and helping people to register to vote. He is murdered on the street with many witnesses. One of those witnesses, black man named Lewis Allen here, witnessed the murder. And when SNCC Field Secretary Bob Moses called the U.S. Justice Department and said, hey, we need to protect Allen, that he is one of the key witnesses, the Justice Department says, hey, we're not getting involved, we can't provide protection, this is a state's issue. And then Allen is also murdered. No one was ever charged for the crimes because there are no witnesses now. And so SNCC volunteers realized that whites could use violence against and even kill civil rights activists without fear of legal consequences. And so two men are murdered and nothing happens. And so voter registration is going to be very dangerous. KOCO, another one to remember. Early 1962, representatives from the major civil rights organizations, including the students in SNCC, CORE, Congress of Racial Equality, and the NAACP all decide, let's combine our efforts, let's all work together to create one super organization, COFO, Council of Federated Organizations. And they wanted to kind of work all together to avoid competition between these groups. And so COFO agreed to send civil rights workers into communities with large black populations to continue the fight for just registering people to vote. and also to develop local black leadership. So it's not just one big leader like MLK. They want to divide it up. And the whole idea is if you take out MLK, then it would fall apart. So they want to really divide that leadership so the movement will keep going and growing. Aaron Henry, seen here, as the head of the Mississippi NAACP, was named president of KOCO. And SNCC provided the majority of the workers and direct action for the campaign because they have all these students. And so how do these KOCO workers organize local communities? KOCO workers received training in community organization techniques in Tennessee, kind of the upper South, in the summer of '62 before heading into the lower South. And the activists then prepared to enter black communities throughout the state. They would learn many valuable lessons in resistance from the locals as they talked to them, and they met in small Mississippi communities. And these are black and white students working for change in the lower South. And at first, a lot of the locals are very wary of the young organizers. They know the danger involved here. And while many were afraid that KOCO workers would provoke a violent white backlash, that somebody's going to die. So to earn their trust, the organizers are going to live in the homes of local people and participate in the day-to-day life of the community. They have to become part of the community to earn the trust of the community. And so they're visiting homes several times per week before they can really convince people, we're all doing this together. If we all do this, they can't get all of us, so let's really try this. And so they're building these strong relationships before encouraging them to register to vote. And they have mass meetings to get people hyped up, to get people ready. And they're often held in local churches, really the center of many of these black communities. And people are coming together to sing these freedom songs, songs about the movement influenced by old slave songs, religious, spiritual songs. And these songs would help to unite and inspire people to overcome those fears, to create a sense of community, to register and fight. And so drawing on black religious traditions, the meetings featured fiery speeches, Bible readings, personal stories about racism, and hope for the future. KOCO organizers also established citizenship schools in towns throughout Mississippi, and they're teaching a lot of the locals how to pass voter registration tests and really advance their communities. Fannie Lou Hamer. KOCO organizers sought to develop local leaders, as I mentioned, and Fannie is one of the keys here. Fannie Lou Hamer became the most influential leader of the Mississippi movement. She was the youngest of 21 siblings in a family of sharecroppers and had very little formal education. She attempted to register to vote in August of '62 and was denied. The white plantation owner she worked for responded by firing her and kicking her out of her home. A few days later, a group of whites fired shots into the house where she was staying in the meantime. She took the registration test again, because she is tough. And she began to work with and teach at the Citizenship Schools and become the local field secretary for SNCC. And local activism challenged the common white assumption that African Americans were content with their lower place in society. And whites are blaming these outsiders, these outside agitators, and they even call them communists who are coming to stir up trouble at the local community, even though it really is the local community really is inspired by this. Black Mississippians who participate in the movement are really putting their lives in constant jeopardy, as we saw with Fannie. The vast majority of white Mississippians didn't participate in violence against civil rights workers, but they're not exactly standing up for the civil rights workers either, because they would face the same risks. They were under enormous pressure from their neighbors to uphold traditions of white supremacy. For example, a white family in Macomb named Hefner was forced to leave town after they invited white civil rights workers to dinner. So just inviting the wrong people to dinner can get you serious death threats. Then things continue to heat up at Ole Miss. 1961, James Meredith, a black veteran, applied to the University of Mississippi to see if they would follow the Brown versus Board decision. When the university rejects his application completely, the NAACP files a lawsuit against the university for racial discrimination. The U.S. Fifth Circuit ruled he should be admitted. Many white Mississippians were enraged by the decision, and Mississippi Governor Ross Barnett promised to defy and fight the ruling. Attorney General Kennedy had to send 500 U.S. Marshals to protect Meredith and allow him to enroll, and really followed him throughout the year. So here he is walking around campus with protection, with serious armed protection. And I love this guy's face because he means business. When he does go to enroll, A riot breaks out on campus when a white mob attacks U.S. Marshals. 2 are killed in the violence, and hundreds are injured. JFK sends 23,000 U.S. troops to Mississippi to stop the riot, just so we can integrate the universities. We'll stop there.